Hello my friends of digital image display, let's do something different today. I thought I possibly could tell you my thoughts on what to look out for when buying a monitor. Now this is not supposed to be a super precise and 100% scientifically correct video, but there sure are a couple of points that are important when it comes to one's choice of monitor. Some of it is quite obvious, other things, not so much. You'll have to look closer. In order to spice this video up a bit and avoid dry theory, I've brought along my two 4K UHD monitors. But don't worry, I'll also be talking about Full HD 1080p and WQHD 1440p screens. Nonetheless, I didn't want to skip 4K UHD since it, after all, more or less is the highest mainstream screen resolution out there right now. Which is why, to keep things fair, I've gone for two similarly priced monitors. Well, almost, sort of. To the left, the so-called LG U2790PQU, on the right, the AOC U2790PQU. The screen by LG isn't really in stock anymore in many places. There may or may not be a successor to this model, but there aren't necessarily many improvements from one year to another when it comes to monitors, at least when sticking to the same specs. Meaning for this video, I don't have to shell out $300 or $400 for the latest model. Last year, this LG screen went for like $320 US. Now it sometimes costs more, sometimes less, depending on availability. The AOC monitor, on the other hand, you could get for roughly $365 or sometimes even up to $480. This too depends on availability. But well, today we aren't necessarily focusing on these two models, but rather on the topic monitors in general. Right here and right now, if you want to pick up a new monitor, what are some things you should look out for? The very first question we should ask ourselves is, what exactly are we planning to do with our PC? Should the monitor be geared more towards gaming or a more professional use case, such as content creation, where good and accurate color reproduction often is key? In simple words, one could say, for gaming you probably should focus on getting a higher refresh rate, basically more hertz, as well as a lower response time, basically a lower number of milliseconds. For a more professional use case, like content creation, you mostly need good and accurate colors. This is where the panel of the screen comes into play. We have to differentiate between TN, VA, and IPS panels. Short and sweet, TN most of the time is cheaper, offers the best response time, higher refresh rates, minimal motion blur, and a lower input lag. The downside, color accuracy takes a beating and the viewing angles suffer too. VA panels, on the other hand, often feature not exactly the best response times, which however strongly depends on the model. IPS happens to be the favorite among many PC enthusiasts. While it mostly is a little more expensive, prices are starting to come down now. Generally speaking, IPS comes with worse response times than TN, but better ones than your average VA panel. A high refresh rate even is an option with IPS, albeit it's costlier than a TN counterpart. In general, one could say an IPS panel offers the best viewing angles and a very good color reproduction. The viewing angles on VA panels are worse than what we see with IPS, but better than TN. The big advantage of VA is the fantastic contrast, which at times can make up for an incredibly good image quality. However, there's one thing I do have to point out. More often than not, it's not necessarily the panel alone that dictates how good a monitor really is. There, for instance, are grotesque TN panels out there with completely washed out colors, and then there also are really good ones out there, costing more, but at first glance they hardly drop behind VA and IPS in terms of color accuracy. At first glance, that is. For years and years, the following thing established itself. TN is best suited for gaming, IPS for a more professional use case, but can also be used for gaming if you're willing to spend a little more. VA, on the other hand, one could say is somewhere in between the two. And there we go, we've now more or less talked about the panels. Next up, we should have some thoughts about the screen size as well as its resolution. The most common standard resolutions right now are Full HD with 1920 by 1080 pixels, WQHD with 2560 by 1440 pixels, and UHD with 3840 by 2160 pixels. The latter often is declared as 4K when talking about marketing, which technically is incorrect. This is why manufacturers now tend to mention both 4K UHD when referring to just UHD. Technically, 4K would support a resolution of 4096 by 2160, but well, I digress. So basically, the higher the resolution, the sharper and better the image quality. Unfortunately, this would cost your PC a lot of graphics card horsepower, another reason why many of us purposely avoid picking up a UHD monitor. After all, we don't always look forward to an expensive graphics card upgrade. However, there also needs to be paid some attention to the actual screen size, since resolution and size at the end of the day makes up pixel density. The higher the pixel density, the better and sharper the image. Here's an example. Let's assume a 24-inch monitor features a resolution of Full HD 1080p. That would translate into a pixel density of roughly 92 ppi. Now, if we were to go by the flawed logic certain buyers have and assume a bigger screen is always better, well, things would look like this. Let's assume the 1080p resolution remains, the screen size on the other hand went up to like 27 inches, then we are suddenly only talking about a mere 82 ppi when it comes to pixel density. The image therefore isn't as sharp anymore. As you have surely noticed, there also are so-called curved monitors out there. They are curved. Those don't really bring any technical advantages or disadvantages to the table, but can make up for a more immersive experience. This is a matter of preference though. I for one don't really like curved screens, except if I'm dealing with an ultra-wide one. The gamers among you could also care about features such as AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. These features basically adapt and match the monitor's refresh rate to what the graphics card outputs. This gets rid of the nasty so-called screen tearing. And then there's the term HDR, standing for High Dynamic Range. The HDR technology, in simple words, allows for consistent, uniform brightness as well as strong contrasts and colors. One of the requirements for this to work, though, is a pretty high screen brightness. And I guess it's obvious that we should, of course, pay attention to the video inputs connectivity. Besides HDMI, DisplayPort should also be on board. Alright, now we can leave the most complicated stuff behind, stuff that can be made out from the specs basically. Things get a little harder when it comes to actual color reproduction, as I clearly had to discover with my two monitors here and others. While the LG monitor, just like the AOC one, comes with gamma settings, the LG model, for my taste, is a bit oversaturated in terms of colors. In my opinion, the color saturation got a bit out of hand here. The AOC monitor offers a slightly more realistic reproduction of colors, if you're asking me. But if oversaturation is your thing, this can also be achieved on the AOC screen if you adjust some settings. If we compare a pure white with our naked eye, we have to face it, in real life the AOC has a slightly more reddish color tone to it, while the LG one a more greenish one. This does partially depend on your personal settings though, such as color temperature and the likes. So I would advise you to read through online reviews before making a final choice, since these are things you simply cannot make out from the specs. Now, if it doesn't necessarily have to be HDR, brightness doesn't really play a too big role when choosing a monitor. However, if, for instance, the sun shines directly onto your screen, the screen's brightness, of course, is crucial, especially if you don't want to work in a darkened room like I do. In today's case, the AOC monitor with 350 candela per square meter is quite a bit brighter than the 250 candela on the LG screen. 350 more or less can be considered a standard. 250 are on the lower, darker side. Now let's talk about looks. In terms of design language, some monitors still happen to be a bit more bulkier than others and come with a thicker frame or bezels. Technically no downsides to that, but from an aesthetic standpoint, probably not really following the latest trend. A more or less frameless design is therefore something we see on more modern screens, but such often tend to cost a bit more than so-called entry-level models. In my case, AOC seems to have done better aesthetically speaking, although that's a matter of taste. Maybe not as important on monitors, but connectivity such as USB ports in form of an USB hub can sometimes also be on board. You see, both screens are somewhat similarly priced, or at least they were. Still, the LG screen lacks USB ports, while the AOC one comes equipped with two. So it depends on the manufacturer, the specific model and pricing, and of course on whether or not you actually need something like that. Nice to have features, on the other hand, for gaming as well as professional use cases are things like ergonomics, basically height adjustment, tilting, swivel, and pivot. Both screens I have here can do all that. But do watch out, if ergonomics play a big role for you, there are some differences on how much tilting, swivel, and height adjustment actually is supported. Last but not least, a criteria not a whole lot of you take seriously is the power consumption. Usually we're speaking of a power draw that more or less can be ignored, but if we look closely, even with different max brightness levels, there are noticeable differences. In today's case with the AOC and LG monitors, the AOC one consumes a little less power, even though it's significantly brighter. And yes, this video turned out quite long, longer than I had initially planned it to be. There is more I'd like to tell you about, but I want to keep the length of the video down. I may or may not have presented you all these points rather chaotically. Nonetheless, I hope you could filter out one useful thing or two. With that being said, I'll see you in the next video.